everyone. Thanks for joining us. I want to give folks a minute just as they continue to arrive, but want to get started for those of you who are here and so patiently waiting for us to do so. My name is Janencia Wood, and I am the Director of Alumni Inclusion and Events over at the Alumni Association. And I'm very happy to be here and really appreciate everybody coming and joining us today. And I just wanted to mention really quickly that if you are interested in more programs like this, you can by all means check us out on our page so that you can follow along with us. And I am sharing that link to everybody with everybody now. There we go. And you should see that in your chat box. Now that should be located in the lower part of your screen, and it should be with a red icon just indicating that you have a message. That's going to be the same place that you want to submit any questions you might have throughout the conversation with Kijua. And we'll do that. As a test, I would love to see if those of you who are on the call with us have joined with a milk or a cookie, and if so, what that is. And if you can share that in the chat feature, that would be fun for everybody. So for tonight's M&Cs, we're going to switch things up. We do have a very special guest with us, as I mentioned, Kijua, and it seems really timely for her to join us today. Traditionally, M&C is designed to be light and informative, but tonight I think we'll probably dive a little bit deeper into conversations around what's happening in the world. So bear with us, because my goal is to still keep the conversation light as much as possible given the moment that we're in. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Kijua Sanders-McMurtry, who is the Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and the Chief Diversity Officer. Kijua, thank you so much for being here with us.
Hi, I'm so happy to be with you all. My name is Kijua. Again, as Janecia said, I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. So Kijua is seasoned at this, but normally I do ask our presenters to share their pronouns with us, just so that we get a sense of who people, how people identify. And with that, I'm going to jump right into our very challenging questions. Are you ready and excited for these riveting conversations, Kijua?
I am, definitely. I can't wait to get to know some of the alum. I don't think I've met all of you yet, but one day, I don't know, our paths will cross. So I'm really excited to meet you virtually.
Start with, given everything that's happening in the world, I want to know what's the best thing that happened to you this week.
Oh, wow, Janecia, this week.
This week, it's only Wednesday.
I don't know, like I think the best thing that's happened to me this week, I think my grandmother always brings me joy. I'm gonna tear up, but my grandma, I'm fortunate enough, blessed enough to have both of my grandmothers living. One is 95 and one is 92, 93. She's not always honest about her age. Let's just, I was able to talk with one this week. I plan to talk to the other one hopefully by tomorrow, but I don't know, whenever I talk to her, she always guilts me into not being home with her. But I'm always just so happy and feel so affirmed and blessed to have her, to be honest with you. And just, she just brings me so much joy. So, and she works out religiously. So she always asks me, have you been out the house? And I have not been out of the house. I've not been for a walk lately. I live across the street from campus. I'm going to try to make sure you can see the campus at some point, across from Mary Woolley Hall. So she's been here and has walked in South Hadley and just doesn't understand why I'm not out walking every day and why I'm on that little thing called Zoom all day.
That little thing, I love that. That's great. So thank you for sharing that with us. That's lovely. Kijua, as I mentioned, you do use your pronouns, and something that we try to encourage folks to always utilize and practice. And while it's not, I think, part of everybody's daily habit, I wondered if you can share with the group why we do that on campus especially.
Yeah, I think it's such an important question. I mean, I previously worked at a gender diverse women's college that I love. I happen to fall in love with women's colleges and feel like there's such an important space. We know that we develop leaders at these institutions, and that we, really we're created at a time when women did not have access to education. And so I think sort of this history of historically Black colleges that were also created because Black people didn't have access to education, we operate in this space of being a place where if no one cares about diversity, equity, inclusion, right, we should care, right? And so I think that knowing that there have always been people who have transgressed gender norms, whether it was, you know, people who cut their hair short when in their family it was like, you know, really controversial to wear your hair short, or wore pants, you know, like I think there's some beautiful alum stories of people wearing pants and that becomes being considered transgressive. There have always been people who did not conform to gender in the ways that society had constructed gender. And we, in fact, have a number of people who identify as transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and probably have since the days we first opened. And so now I think we're in the space of being really clear about what it means to affirm gender diversity among people, to affirm the fact that not everyone identifies with a particular pronoun. Some people use they, them, their pronouns. Some people use Z, zero, zero pronouns. I could do a whole lesson just on pronouns. And so really not assuming someone's pronoun, not assuming their gender is a really important part of why we want to always state pronouns up front, and particularly at Mount Holyoke, where because we're a gender diverse women's college, it's important to not assume that everyone identifies with being a woman, or that even how people identify with being a woman, whether it's femme or not, might be vastly different. And so it's really important for us to just honor and acknowledge that you don't always know by looking at someone how they identify.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you. And I know, you know, we frequently get this question from alums throughout our process of, you know, being out in the community and having alums come back to campus. So I hope those of you on the call found that useful, and we'll practice some of that moving forward. So can you tell us about what you and your department is working on and why it's important right now in this moment to share with our viewers?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're always working on something, you know. I've just started to cook during the pandemic. I don't know about the other folks, but I know we're picking up things we've never done before, probably. But I think that for me, it really is about the fact that, you know, I've always said this about diversity work and how I first came into diversity work, that it's really about healing and repairing, reconciling and restoring. And I feel like when one of the things that I learned early on as a young person was that when people are in spaces where they don't feel like they belong or they can be affirmed, it's hard for them to learn in those spaces, right? And that's true if you are like the only, you know, woman engineer in a company that has like suddenly had engineers, if you are a person of color in a space that has never historically had people of color. It's really important to help people feel like they belong. So a lot of our work is about affirming identity, creating spaces for people to feel like they belong. And in particular, ensuring that the differences we have don't divide us in ways that don't allow us to actually have relationship with one another. So I really do see our work as community building, as relationship restoration. I think that many years ago, I was a dean of students, and I was you know, working in residence life, and there were always conflicts. I don't know how many of you all had a roommate, but you know, when you have a roommate, you know, whether you're from like Louisville, Kentucky, or Pasadena, California, or Newark, New Jersey, there's things that or from, you know, Shanghai, you know, wherever in the world you're from, you may actually just not have had the same experiences as somebody that you were rooming with. And so you had to learn things about each other. Maybe you had different sleep habits or whatever. And there had to be some point of, you know, either consensus building around how you were going to cohabitate together. And that is literally what it's like to coexist on campus. So our work is really about creating opportunities for people to feel like they're part of a community, teaching them about communities that might be vastly different from their own, helping them feel affirmed in their own identity. So it's multifaceted. I like to say it's multi-generational, because we see alum, faculty, staff, and students who care deeply about being in community with one another. And it also honestly is about reconciliation and accountability and acknowledgement. There's a lot of historic harm that has been created in situations, as we've seen more recently, where we actually have to first acknowledge and atone and figure out how to right the wrongs of the world. And to do that work is so important to us at Mount Holyoke in the new Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. So we officially opened on September 9th, 2019. And I feel like, sometimes I feel like that was 200 years ago, you know, particularly now with the pandemic. But I think what has been so life affirming and illuminating for me is that in our ability to kind of, I would say, like stand in the gap in situations where people have felt in crisis, we have been able to really help people feel like they can learn together, or in places where it doesn't make sense to learn, be together as community. And so that's been really, really important. That's the work. So to ask to like be more, like I can be quite loquacious, to be really more substantive and concrete, I would say every day we sort of wake up as a team and we work on all sorts of things related to diversity. And so in our office is the Title IX office. We are really focused on making sure that people who experience discrimination based upon their gender, or if they experience discrimination because they've been harassed, that we are helping those individuals find the resources that they need, find someone who will redress the harm or address that harm and respond to that, and then do so in a way that's both compliant but also equitable. So, you know, that is definitely for us. We think a lot about disabilities and how to make education more accessible for people with disabilities. Obviously, we work on issues of race, ethnicity, gender and sexuality, and religious diversity. So every day we're thinking about those kinds of things, offering programs, doing trainings, meeting obviously with individuals and in committees to affect policies at Mount Holyoke. So that's, I think, the nuts and bolts of the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion.
So you're looking for a lot to do day to day, huh?
Actually, I tell people, like, my job is never boring. I've never like, you know, sat at work. I'm like, you know, I am so bored. Like that just,
that's not a thing,
it's
right?
not the case. I'm never bored, never. Yeah.
Well, that's certainly quite an accomplishment, even from September 9th, what is it, September 9th, 2019. And we have thrown you quite a few curveballs in society and how it impacts Mount Holyoke and all of the things that have been happening. You know, you've had your share of a lot of responsiveness for all of the things that are happening. So definitely we'll continue to keep you busy. And hopefully you'll continue smiling through it all as you do in your great positivity and attitude towards everything. So, so along the lines of some of the things that are happening in the country, a lot of people are asking us lately, you know, how volunteers, and those of you who are volunteers on the call, thank you so much for everything you've done. And if you're former volunteers, I'm looking at you, Wendy, because you're on my screen. Thank you for everything that you've contributed to Mount Holyoke. And so for those of you who are learning to try to learn different tactics and different information around how to engage Black alums and bring their voices and interest to our groups, thank you for asking those hard questions. And Kijua, what would you say to someone who asked you that?
So, so I always like to restate questions to make sure I'm clear on it. It sounds like, in particular, you want me to sort of address the issue of, like, basically, if someone is like in a club or an alum who's like, you know, there are ways we're trying to diversify with, particularly thinking about Black Lives Matter right now. And like, I sort of want to respond to that in particular, because I think that I would be remiss, and I think all of us would, you know, would really acknowledge that if I didn't, you know, both recognize that, honestly, you know, from 1619, really, like, I mean, there's the common reading that's going to be announced has a lot to do with, like, the early days of the founding of America. That has been this question of race. And one of the books, I have so many, like, I love books. So in case you don't, you know this, I'm a bibliophile, you know, self-confessed from birth. My mom says I was reading at 3. Don't ask, I mean, who knows if this is really true, but moms can do that, right? You know, there's a book called The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, who was this incredible professor. He was a white man that taught at Spelman, actually, Spelman College, you know, gender diverse women's college in Atlanta, historically Black college. And Howard Zinn's work, I think, is really important because it helps us think about what is the story of the origin of America that we know, and then what is the story that has had maybe omissions or sometimes situations that haven't been quite explicated for us, such that all of us have a better understanding of how people are experiencing the world that we live in. And so for Black people, I can't speak for every Black person. I happen to identify as Black. You know, but for Black people, I think that, you know, there has been sort of this long-standing understanding. And I would say, you know, my grandmother said this to me. My father's mother actually called me right after the death of George Floyd. And she said, you know, I didn't think I would still be seeing this at 95. I thought that, you know, 50 or 60 years ago, that was it, that when we lost so many people in the 1960s, and then she was just like invoking all this like history. She's like, I just didn't think I have to live there. And I mean, honestly, I wept that day thinking about my grandmothers and the fact that, you know, even to this day, the experiences that they've had have reminded them that, you know, that we live in a world where Black people are still marginalized, and that it's even been difficult for people to acknowledge that. And so there's been this like constant clash when really what we're trying to say is, and what my grandmother said to me is, you know, and she's not a person who typically says things like this, but she said, I feel like we were brought here as slaves, and many people still see us as enslaved people. And that was like just such a hard lesson, a hard thing to hear her say. I will say the other piece, and I'm just going to say this part and then move on, but the other piece is that, you know, I've told this story several times, that last summer I had my other grandmother, my paternal grandmother, here visiting. It was 4 generations of our family visiting. And I was like, Grandma, isn't it beautiful? We went strawberry picking. We did all these like amazing things. And she thought it was the most beautiful place. And she's, you know, she used to live in California. So she sort of like loved the fact that she could be outdoors. And I said, you know, and it's also a pretty progressive place. And she sort of laughed at me. And I said, well, you know, what's funny? And she was like, you know, I was at this grocery store in Chicopee. She was at the Walmart in Chicopee, and she was called the N-word. This is just like 1 year ago, like by a stranger. And I was like so shaken at the time. But I guess what I'm trying to get across is that I think one of the things that we try to impress upon people, and I just did a sort of ally building session with a group of faculty, staff, and alum about an hour ago, is that first we have to acknowledge that there is this reality that many of us are still living in. And then we have to decide what is the decision point we're going to make about the information we have. As painful as it is, as hard as it is to acknowledge, what is the decision point we're going to make, and what is our personal accountability and social responsibility in righting the wrongs we've seen. And then we can think about, okay, so if I really want to engage Black alumni, for example, and I'm not quite sure that they had the exact same experience at Mount Holyoke that I so fondly remember, how do I recognize that I can't atone for everything that they've ever experienced? That might not be possible, right? Mm-hmm. But I can at least acknowledge that their experience could have been different. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe they all, you know, maybe they feel like very positively and didn't have any negative experiences. But if they did, if they do tell us those stories, then we should affirm that that might be their experience of Mount Holyoke, but that we want to bring them to a place that is actually interested in being accountable, in being repairing that relationship, in healing some of that harm, and then restoring that relationship in a way that it is a different Mount Holyoke, so that for the rest of our time in our relationship with Mount Holyoke, we can say that this actually is a place that cares deeply about being in a diverse and inclusive community. And that starts with some accountability. So that's always my advice to people, is to think really critically about the role that you want to play, and that we are, in the spirit of reciprocity, really thinking about how we heal past harms. And it might not always be our individual responsibility to do that, but it's at least acknowledging the harm that might have been perpetuated at some point that the person has experienced. I know that was a long-winded answer to that question, but
no. Actually, it's really important, because actually, so you know, some folks are planning their reunion, right? And while we don't know today what that looks like, because things are changing minute to minute, it's important for people to hear how to engage marginalized groups within their classes, and you know, how to make reunion open and available for everyone, as an opportunity for everybody to participate. And so when you're thinking about and sharing with us kind of how to engage in this education around engaging these groups of folks, people are often asking for ideas to help ensure inclusive and diverse programming or activities, and that's not a cookie cut solution, right? So how do we even begin to think about diversifying our approach to something that's been around for hundreds of years and really been done the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always like so fascinated by, like, I love, when I first heard of M&Cs, I thought, wow, who doesn't love cookies? And then I thought, well, maybe there's some people who don't love cookies, right? So like, I happen to love cookies. It's a huge problem. I was actually so angry at myself that I didn't go bake cookies before this session. So, I mean, I'm probably gonna get some almond milk ice cream and cookies right after this. But so I think that, like, there's definitely some traditional things that feel like, pretty innocuous, right? Like milk and cookies can feel like, this is something that we can do and we can hold on to, and it's a tradition that no one could be potentially offended by. I'm always amazed by, I'll have conversations with people and they're like, I just don't want to offend anyone. I'm like, that's beautiful. Like, that's a great place to start, right?
Yeah.
But I think the other piece of that is to acknowledge that sometimes it gets a little uncomfortable, even with something as simple as milk and cookies, because people might say, well, I need 2% milk, or I need almond milk, or I need soy milk. And we're like, oh, wait, like now we have to go to this store, we have to go do this thing. And I think that, I mean, I'm using that like as a sort of metaphorical, and it might feel uncomfortable to like equate like, challenging racism to this kind of thing. But I think what the reality of that is that sometimes, and I've learned this a lot with inclusion work, people might feel as though like, well, it's going to make us have to do more work to now accommodate this need that this individual has. But what I've learned in inclusion, and there's this wonderful researcher named Daryl Smith that I love. She says, in all the work that she did around access inclusion, what she found is that once you made something more accessible, then you could really truly get to the place of inclusion, because other people who you didn't even know were going to benefit from that thing, were able to access things in a different way. So she gives this example of when they first started on college campuses building ramps for people who had physical mobility, where they needed to either have a wheelchair or something easier to, a scooter or canes. What they found is like a lot of the wheelchair ramps they were building were also making it more accessible for people who were using carts to move food, like the dining staff, to like now have an easier place. So like, that's the beauty of like doing accessibility and inclusion work, is that when you actually center the experiences of the marginalized folks and try to figure out how to accommodate those needs, you open a whole world of inclusion up that might not have ever seemed possible. So I feel like, it's really, really important to think about traditions in that way. What are the traditions that we have that are accessible, that could be possibly modified to be more accessible, more accommodating, more inclusive, and not see it as a deficit, like we're going to lose something or we're going to have to work much harder to do that, but see it as an asset, like who might actually be included and be a part of it and benefit from it now because we opened this door in this way. I think that's just so incredibly important. And that's always what I'm thinking about, like okay, like you've heard this expression, like who's not at the table in the conversation. So when I do race work, if there aren't white people who feel comfortable being in the conversation around race work, then that actually makes me think as a diversity educator, like I need to figure out a space where white people might feel that this is accessible to them. But they're not, that in many of these cases, if I'm talking about race, they might not be the disenfranchised group. They might be the people who have the most privilege in the space. So I need to think about a way to do that, but also be sure to center the experiences of those who might be the most marginalized, because that will allow me to keep my compass focused on that access and inclusion element. So that's what I'll say. But there are many, many traditions that can have all sorts of reimagining that don't have to be lost in this quest to be more inclusive. I think that's always what people worry about, is are we going to lose the meaning of that tradition?
I love that. Thank you, Kijua, because, at the Alumni Association, and actually in collaboration with Student Life, we kind of did a little index of Mount Holyoke traditions. And Nancy, who is the executive director of the Alumni Association, will tell you when she graduated in 1976, there were maybe 25 traditions. And today we have something like 76 or more traditions. So that's just a token to how we continue to evolve and develop new habits and new traditions. And so being able to keep the point of Mount Holyoke and its experience intact, and still be able to develop from that is a beautiful thing. So I love that perspective.
Yeah.
So when we're so this is a little bit of a right on target question, if you will. What we heard was somebody who's really interested in addressing and understanding how the college is addressing the Black Lives Matter and racial equity issues raised by George Floyd's murder. What is the college's plan for equity and inclusion? It's not enough to be invited, everyone must be included.
Yeah, I love this question, and I love any question. So just so you know, I've decided to be a full-time diversity educator right after the tragic murder of Matthew Shepard in 1998 and Sakia Gunn, who were both people who identified as LGBTQ. And honestly, when Matthew Shepard was killed, I still remember it so vividly because it was around the time that I was in love with someone, I was getting married, and I was like starting to like pay close attention to just, you know, injustice in the world in a different way. And Matthew Shepard, in many ways, being left alone to die on a fence because he was gay, stood out to me. It was like, you know, like how could this happen, right? In 1998. And it reminded me of the story of Emmett Till, who was a boy killed, you know, 14 years old and murdered in Mississippi. And so I was thinking like, what is this juxtaposition of like, how do we understand that, you know, there's this way in the world that people are more vulnerable to harm or more likely to die or tragically be affected because of this hierarchy of human value. And the hierarchy of human value is something that Ibram Kendi talks about in a book called Stamped from the Beginning. It's actually a beautiful book. In this book, he talks about how there was this hierarchy of human value around skin color. And so I think about that a lot when I think about like Black Lives Matter, that what we are talking about when we say, you know, Black Lives Matter is this idea that in this hierarchy of human value, some people can interact with a group of people and have one experience, and other people will interact with that same group of people and have a totally different experience. And so, you know, for years, I would not talk about like my interactions with the police. I'm just going to give a personal anecdote again for myself. For many years, I was working as an administrator at a gender diverse women's college in the South. And I was getting regularly stopped by the police. So regularly that I started to count. I was stopped 8 times in 1 year by the police in the town where I worked in. And I was a dean at the college where I worked. So it was so regular that I began to like, and I would like work late nights often. And so I started to take different routes home because I would be so panicked and worried that it was just becoming really difficult. So finally, I was with an alum who I was very close to, who happened to be a white alum. And she and I were driving to DC on a road trip. We were going there for an internship, long story. And I was stopped 3 times with her. And she was so flummoxed. She couldn't believe that, you know, me, her dean, who she had known for like 6 years at this point, would be stopped so regularly, and she never knew. And so my mom was with us on the trip, and my mom, at one point, the alum was saying like to the police officer, and they would stop me and not ticket me. They'd ask me questions like, where are you going? Where are you coming from? These kinds of questions. So she was trying to like engage this police officer, and my mom said, please stop. She's Black, you're white, you don't understand. So then she like starts coming to me all the time, Kijua, you have to speak up about this. This can't keep happening. You know, like I would never have this experience. And, you know, so I started to be more outspoken, but it was a very difficult position to take. And eventually I was stopped on campus as the dean of students and sort of harassed by police officers at that time. The truth is, that's not the experience I had with every police officer, but I had enough experiences that when Sandra Bland was arrested as a Black woman, it was so familiar to me, so uncomfortable to me, so tragic to me that she did not survive that jail stay. And I had a personal experience with it. So when we talk about like Black Lives Matter, right, I don't think I need to like, you know, bemoan this or belabor this. But what we're talking about is this idea that there is a treatment that some people experience because of their skin color that is vastly and distinctly different from others. And that when we think about the fact that George Floyd, that person's knee was on his neck for 8 minutes and 36 seconds, there is something, and that it was on film and it was on camera, And it reminds us of like the lynchings that happened in the past where people would face the camera. They would show their face to the camera. They wouldn't turn their face away from the camera because it was nothing at that point to be ashamed of. That's what makes so many of us so worried, right, about this resurgence. And so at Mount Holyoke, we are really specifically right now, this week, engaged in a Black Lives Matter week. It is a conversation. It has involved all sorts of dialogues and all sorts of workshops. We've been doing it for the last 6 days. We've had, after this call, we're gonna have a private session with Black alum to check in and see if we can do healing work and talk about maybe past experiences they've had. And it's important that we do that work because the community is feeling particularly broken right now and particularly hurt and in pain. And in many ways, we're trying to figure out how do we maintain a community of people who feel like there is a reason to keep living, to keep surviving, and to keep resisting the harm that is being perpetuated against this group of people. So I give you that personal story because I think that, you know, our actions, you know, one of the reasons we chose on Friday to announce during Juneteenth that we would be giving, you know, we had some funds that could only be used for the purpose of giving to a nonprofit. We'd done a previous campaign like this for the Francis Perkins Institute. This is not unusual. Mount Holyoke does engage in these kinds of efforts when we have that kind of restricted fund from a donor. So we were able to decide, well, this time we're going to give specifically to Black organizations that are doing the work of supporting people around legal defense. So the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Marsha P. Johnson Institute, because Black trans people have definitely experienced even more harm than is even imaginable, and their stories are typically erased. It's also true for Black cis women that many of their stories are erased, and that we would give to racial, like healing racial trauma. So we gave specifically to the Loveland Foundation, which is an organization focused on therapy for Black women. So I would say, you know, those are some of the efforts. There's so much more that I could name, but the healing circles have been really powerful. We've been doing them for about 4 weeks. We've had 4, we probably had about 120 people over that time, I calculated, coming together and sometimes just crying in the same space. And just, or finding joy in that space, or talking to each other about healing strategies. That has been so important.
Thank you, Kijua. That's incredible. You know, it's really hard, just if I can interject for a second, it's really hard to kind of have this conversation as a person of color. You know, just from my own experience, it's been pretty difficult for the last few weeks, and continuing to have people ask us to engage in these conversations. And I just really want to take a second to acknowledge the fact that you say this so eloquently, is that you've made the decision to be an educator, a diversity educator. And I think that's really important for people to hear, so that they can protect their friends of color that maybe aren't involved in a daily diversity education role. And so can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's so funny. I had a friend call me last week and she was like, okay, you do this work full time. She's like, has there been like a special meeting of like, and this is like a joke, so just so you know, like I think she was like, of like my white friends might have gotten together and like had a special meeting, like let's all call this person and make sure they're okay. And then she's like, there are people I haven't heard from in like 15 years, right? And I, you know, it's funny. I was just on a call, like I said, right before this. I thought it was so like the best testament to Mount Holyoke, honestly, that I think is so beautiful is that like we planned an event and then like within a day, it went from like 80 people registered to like 400 people registered, because people were like, we cannot believe this happened in the place that we love, a country that we love, and we don't want this to be repeated. We don't want to look up 50 years from now or 10 years from now, or have our grandchildren or our nieces and nephews not have had the experience or have the experience we've had, where we're seeing something so atrocious happening on TV. And so I think that it's really important to recognize that while it's beautiful that we want to do the work of, I'm going to say, for white people who want to be allies or co-liberators in this movement, it's beautiful to know that that's something that you care so deeply about. It's also important to recognize that, for some people, it feels like some people are just showing up for the first time. Like we've been saying over and over again, like clarion call, like please pay attention. Black Lives Matter, not that, you know, we don't care about other lives, but like right now, it is particularly like we feel like this group of people is suffering. And I could name all sorts of other groups of people suffering too. So I think that one of the things that I would, you know, encourage people to think about is if it isn't already a natural relationship with this person where you have conversations with them about race, then I would say like, don't allow this to be like the first time, because I think for some people, they need the space themselves to reflect upon how they're feeling, and they can't then begin to try to attend to all the other feelings that people have. So I think it's important to like watch videos, to read books, to take the time, you know, to go to sessions that are being offered and do some of that work, you know, ongoing. And then as people feel ready, they will come to you and say like, oh, I want to have this conversation. You know, sometimes there are innocuous or like, you know, safer ways to say like, you know, I'm here if you ever want to talk. And that can be enough. But I've seen situations where people are like, I've actually had a couple people reach out to me and say like, Kijua, I really want to educate, you know, my friends who, so I've called all my Black friends and asked them if they will make a video of themselves and send it to me. And then I will share it with my white friends. And I was like, okay, well, you know, like, like not all of us feel comfortable like going out on video and making these statements, or like even like have the time. I mean, we're all like in a pandemic right now trying to figure out like, are we going to be able to be outside in the world again and like have parties and go to graduations? So it just feels incredibly taxing right now, on top of all that, to now have a number of people trying to get us to do more labor and more work, and what many people call like emotional labor and like the people of color tax. So I would just say like, you know, there's so many resources out there, and we continue to try to provide resources through Mount Holyoke, and avail yourself of those before you go and reach out to friends, unless you're doing so truly from a place of support and not in a transactional way, right?
Yes, thank you, Kijua. And you know, that's a really good segue to the next question, which is, how do you engage in these conversations? Like, where do you even start as a person that maybe does this for work, or how do you continue this dialogue? How do you create that space for people to feel safe to continue the dialogue or even start it?
Yeah, so I mean, I have these like steps that I'm happy to share them. We've been talking about doing a videotape forever for alum, right? And I think hopefully we'll be able to make that happen this summer. But like, we have some steps that some friends and I have talked a lot about. So I'll give you an example of like where I feel like I failed around diversity, and how I've learned to invite people into diversity conversations with their identities that I feel like I'm not privileged in. I mean, that I'm privileged in and that they're not, right? So a good example, some years ago, I was doing some work around, it was right after Charlottesville, and there was a situation where I had sent out an email to the campus, sorry, that's my reminder. I had sent out an email to the campus community speaking out against Charlottesville, which, you know, was really when there were like this organization, right, of like white supremacists had gotten together. And in the email, I wrote that, I wanted to address the anti-Blackness that my last community was gonna, you know, I send this kind of emails out to Mount Holyoke. We're gonna speak up about this injustice. And I said like this anti-Blackness. So this student came to see me, asked me for a meeting, and she sat me down and she's like, you know, I appreciated your email, but I was really sad that you did not mention anti-Semitism, because in fact, what these people were chanting were statements that were anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. And she's like, you know, it would have been really important for you to speak up to this issue. And it was immediately like, I thought to myself like, wow, like I hadn't even paid enough attention to to be honest, I had just seen it, like I'd not actually watched it on the news. So I didn't even realize, and I had been just reading the mass media pieces and I hadn't paid attention to the anti-Semitic part. I think I was being very myopic and focused on like, you know, honestly, my own understanding of anti-Blackness. So I had like actually made this mistake. So one of the first things I started doing was thinking like, okay, so how can I educate myself so that I don't make this mistake again when I'm in a situation that I see that my Christian privilege, me being a person who grew up in a Christian normative household, has not allowed me to see the harm perpetuated against people who are Jewish. How can I make myself more educated around sort of Jewish faith practices and ways? And I had been participating in some things, but not enough, honestly. So I had to make a concerted effort. I didn't go to all my Jewish friends or all my Jewish family members or all the Jewish students I'd ever met in my life and say, teach me your ways, right? I literally had to make a concerted effort every day. And so I think so what I learned from that is that then when I had conversations, I was coming from a more informed place. I was coming from a place of saying, oh, wow, like I think Rosh Hashanah's next week, is there anything what are some ways that we can talk about like you feeling supported as a student? How, this is me doing work around students. How can I make sure that Jewish students who might not have the accommodations that they need around, or having to go and ask professors for days off in a very different way than a student who actually has, Christian students might have all sorts of privilege where they don't have to ask for days off because those days are built into the calendar of the college. How do I disrupt that with those students and make sure that they feel affirmed? That was so illuminating for me. And I felt so comfortable after that, having those conversations, but I had to do my own educational work. I could give you numerous examples of mistakes I've made. And, even doing trans inclusion work, there's been so many times as a person who is cisgender, meaning CIS gender, meaning that how I was assigned at birth in terms of my gender is how I identify in terms of being a woman, that, even in that space of being a cisgender person, there are ways that trans people experience gender at Mount Holyoke or in other places that I could be more educated about every day, and then make safer for them to be in conversation and community with me and learn with me. So, and I learned with them. So that to me is an example. And I want to give one last anecdote, and then I'm going to be very quiet, I promise. Well, I guess I'm not supposed to be quiet because this is...
You're not. This is
Well, I'll just like stop that long answer. Like when I was thinking about Harriet Tubman. So, we had a great alum, Deborah Martin Chase, who was the producer of the Harriet movie. It's an amazing movie. If you haven't seen it, we screened it at Mount Holyoke thanks to her. Harriet Tubman held John Brown up, this white, man who fought slavery, abolitionist up, as her, like, kind of one of the people in life that she really aligned herself with. And Massachusetts has a long history of the abolitionists. In Springfield and in parts of Massachusetts, there were people who were speaking out against slavery, who were white people at that time. And we don't teach our young people that history enough. In fact, I don't often feel like, white children know that there are co-liberators, and there have been co-liberators engaged in racial justice for a long, long time. If we told more of those stories, if it was less shameful to think about how we speak up against racial injustice and we embrace those narratives, right? And Harriet Brown felt so strongly about John Brown that when she died, she had created a home for indigent people, and she named it the John Brown Home for Indigent, for former slaves. Right? Like, I mean, just how powerful that coalition was between her as a Black woman who had been enslaved and he as a white abolitionist. Like, we don't know those stories. And so I feel like it's really, really important to continue to think about, I think about like Asian Americans who have been in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, like Grace Lee Boggs. I could name so many people. We need to do more of that work around race, and teaching people, and also speaking up about other injustice. I think it's very important for me as a Black person to speak up against the stereotyping of Asian people and what we've been seeing as a resurgence of anti-Asian sentiment and the resurgence of anti-Semitism. If I'm not doing that as a Black person, knowing that I've experienced harm, if I'm not speaking up for Indigenous people, not taking away their voice, but amplifying their voice, then I'm really not doing the work of being a person who cares about the freedom of everyone.
That's exactly right, Kijua. And I think that there's, before we left campus and when the COVID-19 really started coming to the United States, and, there was a lot of experiences reported by our students and other Asian descendant folks. And it's really, I really appreciate that you say that around the advocacy around lifting each other up, because we've experienced those same injustices. And I think about the fact that we also have like these religious components that we also have to be so sensitive about. And even if, you mentioned earlier that generally speaking, we're Christian normative, and how that really impacts our Jewish faith followers or, our Muslim friends. And so it's really a moment to really think about how you can identify with some hurt or identify with some disadvantage that you have, and really hold on to that and let that be the way that you empower and lift others. So thank you for saying that. And I just want to mention that there's a lot of conversation going on in chat, and so I really want to appreciate, say thank you to those who are answering the questions for one another, and continuing to say that. So I'm really excited to share with you all that I have recently been retitled. For those of you who don't know, I have been recently retitled to be the diversity person for the Alumni Association, which is I'm the director for diversity and inclusion for alums. And so I am happy to continue sharing these resources with you. And if you have any questions, Kijua and I work very closely with one another so that there's alignment between what we're talking about with alums and what we're talking about with students, faculty, and staff. So I just want to put that out there, that this is an ongoing conversation, and we're really invested as the Alumni Association to make sure that this narrative is at the forefront. So just wanted to really quickly question that.
I'm so excited. I'm really so excited for Janincia's new role, because I think that, you know, one of the things of being a diversity educator is we're always learning and growing. So I know she was like, you know, wanting to make sure that she continues to learn and grow. And so across the college, I was talking with Sonia today, you know, about like across the college having diversity ambassadors, because I do think that we need to continue all the time to be cultivating each other and thinking. And next week we're launching a program, a series of programming from the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, that I have a colleague in my office who's white, who is really, really passionate about getting white people together to talk about what it means to be white right now, and to be, you know, very conscious of not wanting to take up space from, you know, Black people who are being challenged, but also wanting to speak up about the issues that are important and wanting to know how to do that. And that always sometimes feeling very awkward. So she's going to be doing a workshop on parenting, like how to parent anti-racist children. She's going to be doing some other workshops on, like, you know, what does it mean to be white right now, and that the healing work that needs to happen there. And so we decided that we would like kind of coalesce together and create these opportunities, so that we really didn't leave anyone behind in this conversation. And so we've had like some people of color healing discussions, lots of things to embrace and discover together, so that we can do this as community building. So I see Janincia as like a really powerful, like a force on campus to be able to get this worked through with each other. And she'll be continuing to disseminate information and make sure that you all have access to the resources that we're providing the campus community. So that's so exciting.
Yeah, and along the same lines of developing this programming and making sure that our volunteers, for those of you who are volunteers, we're going to be doing some special training and providing those opportunities for our volunteers to really be at the helm of this work. So we're really, really grateful for Kijua and her time and commitment to sharing herself with the Alumni Association, so that we can really do some good work. And I think that's overdue work, but we're on the path of, as Kijua said, of repairing and restoring. So I'm really excited to be in this role, and we're looking forward to engaging in further conversation. So we're just about at close, and I just want to make sure, I want to give people the last opportunity to kind of chime in if there are any questions or anything that comes through. And yes, Wendy, I want to just answer your question out loud for everyone. It will be a requirement for volunteers to participate in, we're working out the framework of it, but really we're going to require volunteers to participate in at least half of what we're offering in order for them to continue in their volunteer position. And it's really, it's not meant to be punitive, and I hope it's not received that way, but really to make sure that people are representing the values of the institution in a way that's consistent with how we're sharing the information out. So we're looking forward to rolling that out even more so. So stay tuned for those of you who are volunteers. We're excited to get you on board. And so, Kijua, as people are chiming in,
yeah,
what are you hopeful for over the next few weeks? Because, you know, I have to start with hope and end with hope.
Yeah, like I'm so glad you asked that question, Janincia. Like, you know, you all can tell I'm loquacious and I'm I'm high on the extrovert scale. You know, but I think like you know, one of the things I learned a while ago, and I see that a good friend like Liz from the last college I worked, who's a proud Mount Holyoke alum, and who honestly, I think working at another women's college is like a great example of someone who has mentored students of color, who has been truly a co-liberator and really thoughtful about how she engaged students of color. And it was evident to me from the early stages of working with her. So when she was identified as a posse mentor, I think, you know, when we were all talking about her, it was like a great example. And I knew it was because she had a Mount Holyoke education. Like there's something really beautiful about this place in South Hadley. And so, you know, sometimes when I'm feeling like really in despair, I just kind of look out at the window at the gates and like, you know, like kind of look at Mary Willie Hall. And, you know, I don't get out as often as I should, but I think a lot about, you know, what it was like when people were trying to create a place where women would have access to education. And that even though like you know, humans sometimes are so imperfect, right? Like we are always making mistakes with each other. Part of that legacy and that history is that we were creating space for a group of people who might not have been educated if we had not created this space. And I'm saying we as in like this collective we of the founders and Mary Lyon, all those folks. Like, I think that like, it's so important to understand that, you know, that hope that they had, they planted the seeds and other people provided water and sunlight, and we have bloomed so beautifully. And that's always possible. If we can plant the seeds right now of healing and restoration and repairing relationships and community building, it actually is possible to stop this racial violence that we're seeing. It actually is possible. But if we give up on that and don't believe it's possible and are not willing to plant those seeds, and know that sometimes seeds you're planting are not going to be watered by you and not going to be provided sunlight by you because it's just not physically possible to do all of that, that's like my hope. Like I think about seeding into these young people at this college and helping them believe that the work that they're doing academically and socially and being responsible and accountable to each other actually will make a difference. Because I don't want them to be in despair thinking that this is it for them. All the trauma that they've seen, it's it for them. This is actually not it. I know without a doubt that we will find joy and peace and love and hope together again. I know that. I'm not preaching. I might sound like a preacher, but I actually do know that because I've seen like growth in human beings. And I know it's possible that people are not frozen in time and they're not in a capsule and we all can grow. We do have to face ourselves and sometimes face the ugliness. But, you know, if we can do that, if we can really look at ourselves in the mirror and say, I'm not going to let this go on, that is actually the moment where change can happen. And that's what keeps me hopeful. And I'll just say, I love summer. So flowers, trees, like if I could get to a beach and put my toes in the sand at some point with a mask on, I'm going to do it.
I love that.
And I wish that for you all as well.
Thank you. Can we very quickly, I want to make sure, Adrienne just snuck in a question here, yeah. And I want to make sure we get to it. So she said, they say, she, her, yep. She says, how do you effectively start a diversity conversations in workplace environments, especially when you're a junior member without much power?
Oh, I love this question so much. So I gave this example earlier that I was in a situation where someone was microaggressive to me, meaning that like they were making a comment that maybe on the surface doesn't seem like, you know, it's the end of the world, but it was definitely one of those, like, sometimes they've been equated to like mosquito bites, right? So an example might be like, oh, you know, you're really smart for a woman. Like that's a microaggression, right? It could feel like a macroaggression actually, but like those kinds of microaggressions, I think students who have experience being misgendered around their gender and being like pronouns being assumed, that's an example of like, it's an aggression, right? It feels like I've told you that my pronouns are this and you're doing something different. So those things accumulated can feel very harmful and like a person is not being valued as a human being. One of my best examples of someone being like an ally and speaking up was a person, I was in a meeting with like a smaller meeting, and there were 3 people. I was working in public health research, and this person like said something to me, and it was really about me being Black and he was white. And the person in the room who was sitting with me was actually a Latinx person. And they were like, you know, just listening, but they were the administrative assistant. Like they were literally just sitting there to take notes. And so this comment that was made to me seemed innocuous on the surface, but it was pretty harmful. And I was so stunned, I just was quiet. And the person who was the note taker, who had been completely silent the entire meeting, which was typically the process, they finally said, like, you know, I actually don't agree with you. And in that moment, like, it didn't matter their position, it didn't matter the power they had. They just told this other individual, like, I don't agree with you. That's actually not true. And so I think that sometimes, right, we know that people say silence is complicit. Like, sometimes it's simple as like saying, I don't agree. Can you rephrase that? Can we rethink that? I don't think we always have to be in these high positions of power to do that. I do think there's a cost to doing that. So I never want to, so if you're asking me like, how do I balance the cost of being a person who speaks up in situations where someone's experiencing harm? That is something that we all have to think about how we mitigate that. But I think the first step is to say to ourselves, you know what, this thing I cannot have happen on my watch. So I'm going to at least learn how to say, I disagree, and encourage dissent. That is to me like a first step. I think the other piece I would just add really quickly in my last 30 seconds is that if you cannot speak in that moment, because all of us experience situations where it would not actually be in our best interest or the person we want to be allied with to be outspoken in that moment, find a way that you can either document that situation, right? So either document it for yourself or go and validate that person's experience. If it's a person that you're watching, and say like, you know, I see this, I'm not quite sure what to do about this, but I want to be helpful. Can we together like kind of confirm what we both feel like we're experiencing? And then figure out like, can you look in the handbook of your job? Are there ways that you can make someone else aware of what you're witnessing or experiencing? I think that is really critical. And then when you can't do any of that, I think telling yourself that you are going to be conscious of finding ways to either, you know, educate yourself about why that is happening and how to stop that in future situations, or figuring out ways if there are policies that you can address or disrupt in those situations is really critical. I'd love to give more with great specificity, and I'm always, I always encourage people to reach out to me. Sometimes my bandwidth doesn't make it possible for me to respond constantly, but Janencia helps me with that. So I just really hope that if, you know, if there are recommendations for other things that you'd like to see, that you'll let Janencia and I know, and we'll continue to try to work to offer things to you. It's been such an honor to be with you tonight, and I'm really excited. And I'm gonna make some milk and cookies after our next session. I'll have almond milk because, you know, I can't do the regular milk because I have lung conditioning, but it is going to be amazing, and I hope you enjoy yours too. And if you don't eat milk and cookies and you have fruit, enjoy that as well. It's so wonderful to see you.
Thank you, Kijua. Thank you to everyone who came and joined us tonight. This has been a really powerful and informative session. So thank you, Kijua, for walking us through this. And for those of you who are watching later on, thank you so much for watching back. And hopefully those of you who are able, please fill out the survey that's about to pop up in your window so that we can continue to deliver the programming that you're interested in. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.